You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now it's time to Go Commando.
Good evening, Commandos. Welcome to this new episode. I'm here with a former commanding officer who was in charge of myself when I was a very young, not even a second lieutenant, but an officer candidate. So it started many years ago, and we're going to talk about that here for just a second. But his name is Colonel Col Alexander, and I'm going to let him describe a little bit about where he's from.
Thank you, Fred. It's quite an honor and a privilege to be here and talk to you, Commandos, about some important events that really shaped my life, both outside and inside the Marine Corps. So I'll just start off with telling you that I grew up in a small logging community in Washington State. My father really was and is still my inspiration. He had a love for history and transferred that to me. Like I said, I grew up in the mountains of Washington State, at the base of the Cascade Mountains, and spent a lot of time in the woods, building forts, playing with neighbor friends, reenacting probably every battle from the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I to World War II. Watched a lot of John Wayne movies growing up, and was inspired by them. Was inspired even more by my father's love of history. With that, my father was a high school wrestling and football coach, and so I developed a love for combative athletics very early on in my life. I started wrestling at the age of 5, and concluded that career in wrestling at the age of 25. My final season being one season with the All Marine wrestling team. So it was a formative sport for me, as was football. And I played for my dad, wrestled for my dad, and then went on to wrestle for the Army and wrestle at the Virginia Military Institute as well. But those two sports, although I participated in others, at 5'7", I wasn't a very good basketball player, although I could play defense. I was quick but not fast, even though I liked to run track and ran the hurdles. But really, the experiences that I had on the wrestling mat and on the football field absolutely taught me a lot about myself, and they taught me lessons for life. And my father instilled those in me and I carried those on into the Marine Corps. I was commissioned in 1988 and joined my first battalion as a second lieutenant, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines in Camp Pendleton, California. Spent a few years there. Didn't want to get out of the Fleet Marine Force, and so went to 1st Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, which provided support to the Army Rangers and other coalition forces, providing air and naval gunfire fire support capabilities. A great formative time for me to stay in the Fleet Marine Force and kind of build my repertoire. From there, I reported to Quantico, Virginia, where I was a platoon commander at Officer Candidate School, shaping our new candidates, and then did that for approximately 1 year and went on to our Officer Basic course, which is known as the Basic School, and was an instructor there for a year. I returned to Officer Candidate School during the summer prior to going to Advanced Armor course, the United States Army Advanced Armor course, which is where I put Fred and several others through Officer Candidate School, and then went on to assume a new position at 1st Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion in Camp Pendleton, California again, where I commanded Charlie Company of a 1st Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion. There was able to have a great mentor, Jeff Powers. Colonel Jeff Powers was our battalion commander, who Fred and I highly respect and know very well. Consider him a lifetime mentor, and had a great time as a commanding officer and later the operations officer of that battalion. Again, I didn't want to leave the operating forces, and so I sought a position that I thought was not necessarily career enhancing, but the mission was exciting, and so I came back to Quantico, Virginia, where I assumed a position as a regional desk officer for counter-narcotics division, known as Coalition and Special Warfare, and my responsibilities were PACOM, Pacific Command, and Central Command, and did deployments to Vietnam, Uzbekistan, and a couple other countries in the Middle East. At the conclusion of my time at Coalition Special Warfare, I reported to Command and Staff College as a student in August of 2001. I was at Command and Staff College when the Twin Towers in the Pentagon were struck as a student there on that day, and vividly remember the only thing in the air was F-16 fighters over our capital region from Andrews Air Force Base, looking for other perpetrators that might be in the air. Graduating Command and Staff, I reported to Special Operations Command Pacific at Camp Smith, Hawaii, where I spent a 3-year tour as an operations officer, current operations officer at SOCPAC. During that time, I deployed as an advisor to Afghanistan. Always a student of history, I was very interested in what was happening, obviously, in the war. Wanted to actively participate, and so went to my commanding officer and was able to obtain a slot as an advisor in Afghanistan. My love of history subsequently had enabled me to study the Russian tactics and also the Mujahideen tactics in Afghanistan, which served me well as I took both of these books with me to Afghanistan. The Bear Went Over the Mountain and The Other Side of the Mountain, written from different perspectives of the Mujahideen and the Russian forces, and used those to study the terrain and the patrol routes that we would take the Afghans on to either engage or avoid Taliban contact. Following that tour, I left Hawaii, and at the behest of one of my other mentors, General Paul Lefevre, had helped me obtain a position as the operations officer for the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I spent about a year and a half as the operations officer at the 26th MU, as we call it, and then was selected to command a Marine battalion, my former 1st Light Armor Reconnaissance Battalion, and take them as a task force commander to Iraq 2006 and 2007 in Al Anbar province. At that point, met another mentor, great mentor, now Lieutenant General Stacy Clarity, who is even to this day still a mentor of mine, a great leader, at that time commanding Regimental Combat Team 2 in Al Anbar province. Following that tour, I returned to Camp Pendleton, where I was on the division staff for about 6 months, and then went back to Quantico to become an instructor at our command and staff college, teaching majors, mostly Marines, but also others of joint service and interagency partners at the command and staff college. Following that, in 2008, 2009, I proceeded to Marine Special Operations Command, newly stood up in 2006. 2009, reported there to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina again, where I assumed duties as the G1 in pursuit of a military occupational specialty for our special operators at MARSOC. I remained in that position for about a year and a half, and then was selected to be Joint Special Operations Task Force Trans-Sahara Commander in Africa, where I led about 250 special operators in a fight against Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Maghreb. I returned back to Quantico, back to MARSOC, assumed a position at Quantico, a satellite MARSOC entity, where I retired in 2014. I'm currently an Army civilian working for the Department of the Army. And that sums it up.
Thanks, sir. One of the areas that I'd like to highlight and continue our discussion is when our paths first crossed. You mentioned you were assigned to the Officer Candidate School, where all Marines who do not become commissioned through the Naval Academy, but all Marines through the commissioning program that I was in, the Officer Candidate classes, of us who were dumb enough to pay for our own college and then decide to come in afterwards. And then the ROTC, they go through a program in Quantico, Virginia at the Officer Candidate School, different lengths of time. And that's where in the winter, this time in 1995, where we first crossed our paths first crossed, and he was the executive officer for Officer Candidate School. And it's sometimes for a lot of people, that's their first military experience. I had previously been enlisted, and you're going through things in the wintertime that may not be necessarily fun or may not have been your experience on a college campus, such as the swamps, which we've talked about in the Battle of Antietam, and a lot of the Virginia coastline and eastern portion of coastal Virginia is swamp, and that's what he and several of the sergeant instructors, those are enlisted drill instructors that we have in the Marine Corps, that are the ones that basically put us through the paces for those 12-week programs, and you get introduced to a lot of these swamps, one in particular called the Quigley. And so you get to see which officers have the discipline when in the wintertime. And I know the SEALs, their whole claim to fame is they have the toughest program, and I've never been through it, so I'm not going to comment on theirs, but they actually break the ice in the wintertime. So this swamp is frozen over. Some people don't know about this or may not believe it, but here we have a professional witness that maybe as times have changed, he may not want to. Maybe he'll take the fifth on this. But one thing I really do know and clearly recall regarding your leadership is several of the company commander or the actual commanding officer of the school were not always present, but he had a very familiar face that I saw present at training events. Specifically, I remember seeing him in the obstacle course, seeing him in all areas. He would be at the chow hall, not necessarily eating, but he just wanted, his leadership style was to have a visible presence with these officers. And he wanted to get to know not just the officers, but the spirit. Are these the men? Our class was an all-male class. Are these the men that he believed should be? Because Officer Candidate School is a screening process. It's not a school to necessarily train you on warfare or tactics. It is a course to screen you and to expose you to some harsh environmental conditions and to see if you have the proper leadership that the Marine Corps is looking to lead its young Marines, and later on, officers and Marines in the worst places around the world. And one of the things I clearly recall, besides this swamp environment that you and your leaders there introduced us to, and not just your constant presence, was, and I'm going to ask you a question about this, but you would canvass the lines, not necessarily when we were in instruction, but in like the chow hall lines and to get some food in the mess hall. But you would try to get to know the people, but the different officer candidates. And one of the questions I clearly recall you asking, and I had served prior as an enlisted Marine, and I kind of knew what he was getting at, was he would ask a lot of questions of each of the candidates that he could talk to of what their athletic backgrounds were, specifically those who were in combative sports, whether it's wrestling like he had been, or football like he had been, or a very demanding team sport. Those were people that he took an interest in. And I don't know if he was making any notes in a log, but can you tell us a little bit about why you're the executive officer, you're the one that's really advising the commander of in this screening process of, some people may think that sports are not that important, or it's mainly entertainment, or it's just athletics, but what does that show you about the character in those trials, that some are successes, some are not, some are up and downs? What were you trying to get at, and what does that show you about the leadership of somebody in an entry-level phase?
So what we're really looking for, in fact, the theme or the motto of Officer Candidate School is Ductus Exemplo, and that's Latin for lead by example. And that's something that you will find or should find in every Marine officer that you come across. They have all been trained and raised that way. And so, to provide, to be a leader by example in everything you say, do, it comes down to, is that individual going to have a bias for action? And I'm not talking about being a cheerleader, but I'm talking about from the heart. Do they feel, are they a team player? Can they inspire others when the going gets tough? And I specifically, I wouldn't say targeted, but I would ask the candidates what their experience had been. Why did they want to join the Marine Corps? Why had they come this far to be an officer of Marines, a leader of Marines? And the answers, for the most part, were pretty much the same. They wanted to be involved in something that was bigger than themselves. That's the right answer. They wanted to contribute something that was bigger than themselves. And so as a baseline, I was able to ascertain, I thought, in asking them some of these questions of where they come from, what sports had they been involved in, what was their base. And really it was an effort on my part to really surge trust, that I knew that I could trust them, I knew what they were telling me was the truth, that they did in fact want to be part of something bigger than themselves, because we're about to put Marines' lives in their hand, and it was very important to me to ascertain what they were about and what their motives truly were. And not all made it. The attrition rate is fairly high because we're not looking if you can pass the physical fitness course or physical fitness portions. That's part of it. But really what we're looking for at OCS is your propensity to lead Marines. Can he do it? Can he take charge? Can she take charge? And that's really what we were trying to get to. And it's quite a challenging task, actually, in 10 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever the program is. So that was to see if you have what it takes. You got the...
Yes. And see, there are several requirements for Marine officers just to show up at an officer candidate school, of which you knew about before and you don't have control over, but you have to be physically fit. You have to. You can't be having a criminal record. You have to have a college degree, and those are just coming in the door, knowns, givens that everybody has that. But the selection process and what you were doing is you were actually looking for those that could, as you were demonstrating, and I clearly saw that. Even I remember the last day he was, as he mentioned, was selected to go to the U.S. Army's armor officer captain's course in Fort Knox.
Yeah, Fort Knox.
And right as he was leaving, the day he was leaving, he was down there in the chow hall lines, basically demonstrating that enthusiasm and really encouraging us. And probably not, I'm sure he wasn't instructed to do that. That was just but that was something that was impressed upon us. I mean, as he was leaving, Virginia heading to Kentucky, he had, I'm sure, many other things to do, but how important is that leadership trait of, encouragement and enthusiasm for a Marine officer versus somebody that is not as, that's just more inwardly focused?
Yeah, so there's obviously a bunch of different leadership styles. My leadership style is very involved, very engaging. I want to know what makes you tick because you're going to have my back, and I'm surely going to have yours. There's an axiom that I like to profess, and that is that leaders, in this case, Marine leaders, don't need to be there for the awards presentation, although they will be. They don't need to be there for the accolades from their superior telling them they did their good job. That's all great, but quite honestly, that's expected. Success is expected. And what I tried to promulgate, I think through all the commands that I was involved in, is to relay two things. One, that regardless of your rank, every Marine is a leader. I don't care what your pay grade is. I don't care how long you've been in the Marine Corps. Every Marine is a leader. And I expected them to stand up and take charge and have a bias for action, make things happen. And the thing that I always enjoy saying, and even now and to live by, is leaders must position themselves at three points: a position of friction, a position of failure, and a position of transition. And so in this case, these gentlemen were in a position of transition. They were getting ready to take a next great step in their lives towards becoming Marine officers. And on this last day, wanted to see them off. It was a period of transition for both themselves and for me. But it's extremely important for good leaders to be at the points of friction, failure, and transition. If things are going well, that's great, and you can be there. But that's where you really need to be, whether it's in peace or at war, in the garrison or on the battlefield.
And it was about a year later, in the same time period of the winter of 1996, that our paths crossed again. And he was already stationed on the West Coast, and I was heading out that way, and we both ended up with orders to the Light Armored Vehicles Leaders Course, which is in Camp Pendleton, California. And one of the things I recall at that moment was not just that we went through that course together and we learned side by side as students. Although you're a captain and I was second lieutenant, one of the things was the minute that I had, they told me that I'm no longer going to be stationed in Camp Pendleton. Once we finished that course in December, I was going to be stationed out in 29 Palms. And one thing that I have not seen a lot, unfortunately, from a lot of the officers, but I have seen with several of the people who have been mentors of mine, was, he really did, not because he was trying to help me necessarily, but he had a bias of action and he engaged certain leaders and I'm not necessarily who they were, but to not just make my orders to remain in Camp Pendleton, but to bring me on as his one of his platoon commanders in the company that he was taking over, which did mean a lot to me as far as, I'd known him from the year before as our company executive officer, that he was aggressive and he had that mindset of being a warrior's warrior, somebody that was inspirational. And, the question that I'd want to ask is, how was that something that, through your upbringing, whether it's a coach, your father, other military mentor, what taught you to really develop that type of inspirational leadership for those Marines that, you sought to have lead your Marines in your company?
I think, I've got to give a lot of credit to my father. My father is an inspirational leader, and I took that with all the teams that I was on. It became how I lived. That the team was greater than the individual.
Yes.
Even though wrestling is an individual sport, it was all about the team, and so that when you observe certain folks that have, I won't even call it a like mind, but they have shared values, they have a shared work ethic, they have a shared, in this case, a bias for action, and the other thing I think that I noticed about Fred and a couple of the other guys that I basically recruited for to be in my company was that they wanted to work hard. They wanted to train hard. And, we have an axiom in the Marine Corps that goes like this: train as you fight, because you will surely fight as you have trained. And I used to have this sign up on my bulkhead, for those of you not in the naval service, so up on the wall, that said this. It was from a Roman historian named Herodotus, and he wrote this: each Roman legionnaire daily throws himself into his training. Indeed, one can characterize their training as bloodless maneuvers, but their battlefield actions as sanguinary events. So, by that, it illustrates the fact that you have to train hard to get results, and to make your Marines the best prepared that you can make them for what they're about to face. And this is in 1996. This is before the war, but even then we're preparing. We're all preparing mentally and physically, emotionally for what, quite honestly, what we hope we will face. That we can that we can carry this torch that our ancestors have carried and be worthy. Yes. And be worthy of that. And I have to give Fred a lot of credit here, because this guy can train Marines like no one else. I learned things from Fred, and when he was a platoon commander, he had been a prior enlisted Marine, but he would train his guys incessantly. I mean, we would finish a training day, and Fred would have these guys up all night, training all night on the weapon systems. They would hike. They'd come back. Steve Stratton told me this, by the way. They would come back exhausted the next morning and show up at the formation ready to train again. But this is the kind of preparation that I would credit Fred with something to brag on later on in the broadcast. That Fred, with all his deployments to combat, did not lose a Marine. Is there some luck involved there? Is there some fortune? Absolutely. But I know without a doubt that this man trained his Marines to the utmost, and I think it paid off. Yes, train like you fight, because you'll surely fight like you've trained.
One of those other instances when we were in the same company as you were our commanding officer, there was a night in February of 1998, and we had just finished our pre-deployment training period, about ready to start a month-long leave period where they call it port and starboard. So half would take leave for 2 weeks, another half would take leave for 2 weeks. And we had just came off of our qualification exercise called the SOC, or Special Operations Capable Certification Exercise. So everybody was happy because we're about ready to go on leave and take some time off. And another gentleman, senior officer, he was in charge of all the Marines that went out on the ships in our task force, colonel named Colonel Moore, call sign Tango. He was a pilot, and he was another inspirational leader. And we had just finished this exercise. He had a mandatory officer's call for every single officer in the entire Marine Expeditionary Unit that we were deploying with. So they, in my case, a single guy, and the people who were married, they showed up down in downtown San Diego, this swanky hotel called the U.S. Grant, which for me was mildly amusing. We just wanted to get out and go out in San Diego afterwards. But we all showed up down there, and I clearly remember the MU commanding officer instructing one of his other officers to close the doors, the hatches as we call them, and there amongst everybody with their wives, girlfriends, whoever, the MU commander told every officer to recall all their Marines that night, and that the NATO weapons inspectors had been kicked out of Iraq, and our Marine Expeditionary Task Force would be leaving much sooner. It was the following week. So one of the things that, as funny as that story may be, we lined up ready to leave the following week, 2 weeks or several weeks ahead of our normal schedule.
Yep.
And a lot of concerned faces were there, family members showing up. And I remember specifically the face of one sergeant's wife, sergeant in our platoon, Laura. She did not know me very well. We didn't have too many. We were training. We didn't have a lot of functions, but she, without saying a word, looked straight at me, and I could tell she was. As we knew that we thought we were heading for another Desert Storm. We were going into combat, and that Iraq was going to run over Kuwait, which has ended up where we went, but not what we did. So she looked at me without saying a word, saying, you bring her husband back to her children. And, at that point, what you had trained at OCS, and that enthusiasm, that encouragement. And I knew that even some fellows, other senior officers in the battalion, didn't necessarily like how the training that we would go around the clock, or the resources that were required. But it's important, and it doesn't start when you leave on deployment. It doesn't begin when you get overseas. It really starts the minute that unit comes together. And for the leader, it starts the minute that you raise that right hand and take that oath to our Constitution, our way of life. That being said, you went on the same deployment. In your mindset, I know they would decide to separate some of our assets because we had some pretty heavy rolling stock. And you had me go on a ship, hopefully not to send me off as the black sheep, but explain some of the decision makings that you had to separate, and the main body with the main company, which you embarked on the USS Mount Vernon and placed me on the Tarwa. What's some of those decision makings, knowing that we're going to go to war, we're not going to be able to communicate face to face probably until we get over into Kuwait, and that we're probably going to go into battle. What were your thoughts?
So my thoughts on that, at that time, were that, quite honestly, that I needed to put my best platoon on the big deck, on the USS Tarawa, the LHD, LHA, and and so I put Fred over there on the Tarawa because I knew he was mature enough to handle. He could deal with the command structure, and he would be my representative for the entire LAR company, which is embarked on a different ship. But Fred would be my would be my representative for First Light Armor Reconnaissance, and I knew that he would represent it well. I chose to have the majority of the combat power on that ship. I was a commander of troops on that ship, but I thought it offered a right mix of flexibility, operational flexibility, to put you on the Tarawa, and the rest of the company on the USS Mount Vernon. It kind of goes to back to another lesson, I think, of leadership, and in that if you're asked to provide a person from your organization to represent you in some important endeavor, who do you choose? Do you choose the guy that you just kind of want to get rid of? Because if you do choose that guy or gal, they're going to represent you as such, right? So a lesson learned for us for a long time in the Marine Corps is that if you're going to give somebody up, and if I'm going to put someone with the French, or I'm going to put someone with the 82nd Airborne or with the 75th Ranger Regiment as a liaison officer, an LNO, so that I can have good communications between both units, I'm going to choose my best guy, right? I'm going to choose my best representative to represent the overall organization, and that's really it. I mean, it was quite an easy decision for me to put Fred over on the Tarawa, because I knew he was going to represent me, in the highest fashion, and he was going to represent our battalion commander in the highest fashion. So these are all decisions that you almost don't think about it, because it's just the right thing. It's the right thing to do. You take your best and you apply them. So,
well, we are still on that in that company's life cycle. I wanted to ask you two questions that apply to what we've been studying here with the Battle of Antietam, and that is, and I'll ask both these questions and let you answer them. The first is, General Lee, he had exercised what a lot of people talk about, and that's, with your key leaders, your officers, providing that and allowing your officers to have that special trust and confidence. And the second was, well, we served together as captains and lieutenants. You had been the operations officer and had developed very detailed plans from a former mentor of yours on utilizing armored vehicles to conduct reconnaissance and raids deep behind enemy lines. And the first evolution where, after leaving being the operations officer and sort of serving in that capacity while you're going to this course that we were in, but then assuming command, and that was the very first, as checking in as a second lieutenant, a lot of responsibility, a lot of potential for failure, but your mindset demonstrated two things that I think are important, which I'd like to, your ability to trust the decisions of a brand new second lieutenant and officer that's unproven to you in the fleet, Marine Force, and then second, the complexity, and if you would just describe some of the evolutions that you had planned and we'd executed as these deep strikes. One was Operation Long Ball and one was Deep Strike, and what those encompassed, and how you plan to anticipate that certain things could go wrong, and as a commander, what you did to ensure that the mission would be a success.
Right. So both evolutions, both Operation Long Ball and Deep Strike, were training exercises that really taxed the core missions of our unit, the Light Armor Reconnaissance Unit, and it taxed them by the scenario of putting them deep behind enemy lines and then reattacking in an opposite direction over a over a long expanse. In this case, over 500 miles. So we were airlifted from March Air Force Base to Fallon, Nevada, where we struck some simulated targets.
What were the environmental conditions of the mission?
As we landed and assembled in our coil with our company, it started to snow, and so it was
January time.
It was in January. It was January in
northern Nevada.
And the snow continued to fall.
Very first operation.
It was our very first operation, right? So there's some lessons learned from that. I mean, you plan for a logistics resupply. You plan to refuel your vehicle. That's going to be very important. How do you do that behind enemy lines over a 500 mile expanse? How do you ensure you have enough ammunition? And oh, by the way, do your heaters work in the vehicles?
Right.
Right. So in California, you don't necessarily always have to use the heaters, and we found out that some of the heaters didn't work over the course of the next few days. But the planning was very detailed, and we were able to exercise a combined arms approach on a couple of different targets. Targets meaning ranges that the Air Force had uses at their Top Gun school, and so the company was able to engage in a live fire event using combined arms, which is something that we had talked about here at Antietam, and in this case, Lee's use of cavalry, artillery, and infantry, and using those things in combination. So we exercise that as part of our training regimen, part of our qualifications, and part of the way we fight, we war fight. Subsequently, through the snow and the mountain passes, as we retrograde, hit the target near Fallon, and then begin to retrograde back over 500 miles
through the mountains.
Through the mountains in the winter. Fred's leading the way, and we made our way back. But as we did that, we exercised something that is fairly unique, a unique practice in our community and at that time in the Marine Corps, was a system of helicopter-borne fuel bladders, which would land, bring out the hoses, and then we would fill our vehicles up, and we'd refuel the whole company literally in about 15 minutes, and then we would be on our way to the next target, and in this case, retrograding back to Camp Pendleton. It's called rapid ground refuel, and this technique is which we perfected there at LAR. It had been used before. It wasn't just us. Later on, used it in Al Anbar province, rapid ground refuel as a means of striking deep behind Al Qaeda lines, where they knew we only had a certain range for our vehicles. Right? They knew how far we could drive from our base, and being able to leave at night, proceed all the way, to a certain link-up point, refuel the vehicles, and then strike another, 150 miles deep into Al Anbar and find our targets where they thought we couldn't reach. So the extent.
Some of the tactics that General Lee's Army had used here in the Battle of Antietam with, going into Harper's Ferry to seize, basically a long, deep raid into enemy territory. And that's what this Operation Longball was during the environment of the winter, to conduct a raid. But there's also another one, just like Lee employed Jeb Stuart in a cavalry fashion to go out and reconnoiter. We did another one that was in the summertime, testing in the opposite type of environment.
Yes.
Going equal. If you want to talk about some of the things that you had experienced from that.
So
middle of summer.
This was in the middle of summer, high heat, which again, you look back on it, it served you well for going to Iraq or Afghanistan. But we pushed all the way out to the Colorado River in what's called a screen line, and set up out there again, traversing over hundreds of miles to that location to conduct our mission in a an environment that was very hot.
Which can be
devastating
not
to the vehicles
for the men, but the vehicles. If we're used to operating on a cool climate along the coastline, that can, just like with the heaters in the wintertime, it can have an adverse effect on the equipment.
But no air conditioners.
No air conditioners.
So I think the point here that needs to be brought out is, you're not only responsible for yourself, you're responsible for your Marines, but you're responsible for the equipment that really is going to keep you alive. And so I think what we drew from that, from being a part of this light armor reconnaissance unit, is an attention to detail for maintenance. And I'm not a mechanic, but I'll tell you what, I know exactly who to ask and when we need to conduct maintenance and how often we need to conduct maintenance for the survival of those vehicles. Because those vehicles, in turn, were our weapon systems, and if the vehicles don't survive, then we probably don't survive. The other thing that occurs in this environment, as far going back to a team, is that the vehicle crew, driver, gunner, vehicle commander, and then 4 scouts in the back, a 7-man crew, we emphasized that this was a team. The vehicle was a team. Previously, in some other versions, the scouts in the back, who are your reconnaissance, ground-based reconnaissance element, were very separate from the vehicle crew. And we endeavored to bring all 7 of those individuals together and work as a team so that everyone conducted maintenance on the vehicles. Everyone stood the watch in the turret at night. And and obviously going forward to Iraq, took all those same principles and applied them. But Operation, Long Ball and Deep Strike were some seminal training events that basically helped refine the basics of your trade, of our trade, and. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, and to see if it can amplify it a little bit more, those were very large battalion training exercises which our company participated in, but you had one in particular that you devised yourself as a team cohesion, building upon, trying to find the strongest team, but it was very outside the box. In today's day and age, a lot of commanders may not want to assume this level of risk, but again, had a commanding officer who was and still is mentor to both of us, Colonel Powers, who really fostered that fighting spirit, being able to move, shoot, and communicate. Those things were things that he fostered and tested and sought that competitive spirit. But one of them, these exercises you yourself developed, and can you talk about?
Yeah.
I know he's probably not going to talk about the level of skill, so please do. It was very complex. Involving, scores of miles on and off base that Marines had to do numerous events. But if you could describe that a little bit and what your vision was to test the mettle of these teams.
So it was an event. It was a reconnaissance event that was designed to test you both physically and mentally. And the objective was that each team would go after a different target, and they had to provide information on that target. The only thing was they were in civilian clothes. They were not in their vehicles, and they were sent to observe and report on different targets around Camp Pendleton, around Oceanside, San Clemente, to the north, and they were given specific targets: a train station, a bridge, an overpass, a school, a government building and gather as much information as they could. And these were fairly long legs. I think they at least got a good 5-mile run out of it, and maybe if not more. They were out there for a few hours, and then bring that information back to the command post, and then we would assess how they did with how much information, the sketches that they made, the reports that they were able to provide. I think it proved a pretty good drill. Was it novel? I guess it was. It just seemed like. It just seemed like a good training event. It was something that was a little different, that piqued these guys, piqued their interest, but it challenged them at the same time. And I think it's important to note too that with the Marine Corps, we don't, especially before the war, we don't get a lot of money. So it's something that forced you, and Fred always, he could probably go on to 5 other training events that he did. Something that was creative, something that was novel, that provided really a different level of training for his Marines. And so he always tried to be a little creative, to just put a little bit different spin and motivate the Marines to practice their trade, on a different level. One of the motivators during this time that I was command was a government shutdown, and the government shut down for a month. And what that meant was any of the fuel that we had on our fuel farm, maintenance on the vehicles, the money stopped. And so we could not use our vehicles. We didn't have enough fuel. We didn't have enough ammunition to train with. And this went on for a month. So a couple of things that we did is we would run in formation like we were in a vehicle, right? And the vehicle commander would carry his binoculars, and we would run across the terrain at Camp Pendleton, undulating terrain, and overwatch positions, and practicing that, and that's how we would move as a vehicle, even though we were running really in formation. We would run as a vehicle teams, and that was just designed to, enhance teamwork. I think one of the other things that I recall that now that Fred has mentioned it is when we did run out of the government shutdown, didn't have fuel. The XO and I the executive officer and I had arranged to go down to the Camp Pendleton golf course. And because we were a light armor reconnaissance unit and we did practice driving and formations and different bounding and overwatch of continuing overwatch in our vehicles, we put the vehicle commander, the gunner, and the driver in the golf carts at the Camp Pendleton golf course, and asked that the golf course reserve that morning for us for 3 or 4 hours, and they did. And we practiced formations, driving the golf carts around, which turned out to be pretty fun too. So,
and if you can't sustain those extras, some people just decided to have some kind of a class without doing any, even trying to replicate the training. And because there's going to be times when you get on ship where that's all you can do is classes, because you're not able to use those capabilities. But, being able to get out and actually be in a different environment and test that's the kind of creativity, as well as you are encouraging your subordinate commanders, myself and another officer, these are ideas, that the company commander has. And you were supporting creativity, and it was very, very powerful. Not just during that life cycle of that command, you were in command, but throughout the rest of your and mine and others' careers. However, there's, and I'll use an example not to disparage a unit, but a lot of people recall that the Americans who were held hostage in Tehran for 444 days. And in 1979, a Joint Special Operations Unit did a combined raid in an attempt to rescue these Americans that were held captive. And a lot of people think that it was set up for failure and that we should have trained, and they don't really understand if they haven't read this particular book called The Guts to Try that talks about that. And it was very highly coordinated. They used, the latest technology and information on weather, and there's just some things that couldn't be factored. But when you have a unit and you've been in command of many, as you described earlier, that, and I'm going to ask again 2 questions. One, when a subordinate commander who's doing everything they can to do the right thing, their heart's in the right place, and they're giving every effort, every cell is working towards to accomplish your mission, but they don't just fall short, either a disaster or near disaster happens, how you handle a situation like that in ensuring that leader continues to have the focus and the motivation. And then on the opposite side, and then I'll let you respond, when a subordinate leader, again, who's either a commander or staff, is falling short intentionally, and he can do more, but they don't want to do, how do you both determine how to develop that person, or what's the decision point when it's, this person, and how do you handle removing somebody?
How do you take someone who is a leader who is genuinely trying hard,
yes,
and wants to do the right thing,
but it's had a setback.
But they've had a setback, or maybe there's something in their background or their training that is deficient, So I think the first thing is you can't have a zero defects mentality, right? Everybody's going to make mistakes, and that's where you find your good leaders. I think you find your mentors, right, who are willing to tolerate mistakes, with the motivation being that person who's made the mistake is willing to make course corrections, willing to correct themselves, and basically make it right and make it better and take it to the next level. The impetus or the willingness to improve is really what you're looking for as a leader. I'll give an example of that. In fact, Fred was present for this. We were at a range, a live fire range, and it was a tactical scenario. So we drove up on the range, and we started firing and engaging targets. One of the vehicles on the hill next to me was a tow variant, wire-guided missile variant, and he was getting ready to fire his weapon system, and I asked him to give me a position report. Basically, give me the grid of where you're at. And at this time, we had both an early version of GPS, and we had our maps. And the vehicle commander in charge of the tube-launched optically guided wire missile, the TOW-2 missile, could not give me his position. And his excuse was, this sergeant at the time, that he could not, his GPS was not working. And so he did not, even though we were on a known range, he could not provide the correct location. So I asked him to pull out his map, and he didn't have his map with him. So the dependence on technology at that point, at that moment, dawned on me that if we can't do the basics, if we don't have the basic skills down, in this case map reading, how are we going to do it in the middle of a desert, whether that's Afghanistan or Iraq or Africa? If we haven't mastered the basics, then how do we truly take advantage of this technology if it's not working at that time? So we got done with the exercise, went back to our camp, Camp Pendleton, and had everybody turn in their GPSs for the rest of the workup, and we just used maps. I don't know if you remember that or not, I do. But it was a difficult lesson to learn for all of us. I felt it was a good teaching moment for all of us, that we can't rely solely on technology, and if we're masters of the basics, then we always can fall back on that. So, in that case, I felt we deployed, even we deployed early, we were ready, and we had mastered those. We had mastered those TTPs. Your second question. I'm sorry. You have your second question. What do you do when you have someone that really doesn't really care, or for whatever reason they don't have the motivation, or they're not responding. They're not responding to to the prompts, to the second and third chances that they may be given to perform, and in this case to lead. In those cases, again, a zero defects mentality. As leaders, I think we have the responsibility to provide that path to allow you to improve. At the end of the day, if you choose not to, or you're incapable of doing it, then the lives of Marines are depending on you. They're depending on me to make that decision. And so, in several cases, I've fired both officer and enlisted who failed to perform up to standard, and in every case, I believe it to have been the right decision. I think I made a statement early on that said, everyone's a leader. If everyone in your organization is a leader, that means they take on a mantle of both responsibility and accountability. And I think that is vital to the success of any organization. So if you're responsible and you're accountable, that means that you own it. And if you own it and you're not up to the task, then I would rather have a corporal in charge of the vehicle than I would a staff sergeant. I would rather have a lieutenant in charge of my communications section instead of a major. And in both accounts, that's fortunately, I think the decision that was made, and the unit was better for it, and the Marines' lives were no longer in danger, I felt.
There's another time, and obviously these questions are unscripted because we familiar and know each other, but we're able to talk about things and laugh about them now. But at the time, this next incident was something that the whole company was very, very concerned. It was a very serious matter, and that was when we deployed together in our Charlie company that you were in command of. There's a time when we were out training in Jordan in this high desert environment in the Katrana training area. We actually did a night live fire raid, and you train and train. And this is actually at the tail end of not just our training to go overseas, but the tail end of our deployment. And pretty much after this, we were heading back to the U.S. So the Marines are as trained and as ready. And it was at the end of this training exercise. I think we were there practically a month in Jordan. But I specifically recall, we had the entire company online a night, although the illumination was pretty close to 99% lux. It was good visibility. But one thing that the Jordanians had done is they had dug, which we were not completely familiar with all this area. They had dug these hold down positions for tanks and armored vehicles to go into, and where they could stick their turret out and fire from. But not everyone could always see these, especially if a driver in a vehicle that has his hatch buttoned and they're looking down and there's some debris at night as you're driving. Very difficult because they can't always see these obstacles because they're subterranean. It's not something sticking out. But I do recall that night, after we completed our live fire raid with the vehicles, during our retrograde, we were moving back at pretty much as full speed as the company could maintain, our formation. And we had one vehicle that actually had the MU commanding officer.
He did. Yep.
on board the vehicle, it fell into one of these tank hold down positions, injuring, the Marines, to include the Marine commanding officer of the task force. In a situation like that, what were those thoughts in your head going on? I mean, it's your Marines injured, not through any intent, but also knowing that the MU commanding officers on board that vehicle. What were your thoughts at the time, and how do we rectify this? What did you need to do as a commanding officer to resolve what had just happened?
Right. So when the incident occurred, the commander's vehicle was actually directly in front of mine. I watched the vehicle basically disappear, and then actually drove alongside, drove by it, realizing that it had gone into a hold down position. The MU commander, several Marines were injured, and again, we go back to training. We went through our medevac procedures, reported it, brought a bird in to evacuate the colonel and a couple other Marines, and again, back to the training. It was a matter of SOP. It was no one was, thank God, no one was killed. We went back and reviewed our standard operating procedures, and some of these things happen in training. Could it have been avoided? Could we have gone slower? I think there was an investigation, which we always do, and I think it was determined that we were within our limits of our SOP. That in retrograding out of a raid site, that's exactly what we would have been doing. And everybody's nods were night vision devices were functional. I think it's that was one of those events that they happen. You train hard, and there are injuries, there are deaths that do occur in training, but it did not alter the way we were going to fight, the way we did business. Thankfully, the MU commander did not fire me. He had a few. He did not die. He had a few. He had a few broken ribs. But it did cause us to take a good look at our standard operating procedures. Were they right? What would we change? To my recollection, we had done everything that we said we were going to do, and executed it as such. And Colonel Moore ended up being okay, and the Marines, banged up, but they were okay. Finished the rest of the deployment
with broken ribs.
With broken ribs. In fact, after that, I think you remember we got on ship, and one of the lead vessels was dispatched to Asmara, Eritrea, to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation after we pulled out of the Gulf of Aqaba there. So
we actually left there early too.
We left there early too. We got backloaded the ships and sailed for Eritrea down the Red Sea.
And it's important for a lot of viewers to understand, as he described, you have standard operating procedures for all kinds of contingencies that you anticipate could happen, but there's always some unexpected, whether in this case it was a man-made obstacle, or in the case of Delta Force attempting the hostage rescue of those Americans in Tehran at Desert One, you have a natural obstacle in the form of an environmental condition that creates things that were beyond something that was expected. In both situations, it was treated by the leaders seeking the naked truths of what had happened and being as honest, because we want to improve and we don't want to, be timid in how we train. We want to, move forward and have those leaders continue to be leaders and lead and not be timid. So, can you describe another event that is something that you had that really set you back, that surprised you and kind of tested your soul, that you did not think that a Marine or an officer would behave in a certain way, and it kind of shook you to the core?
Yes, there's probably a couple incidents, and I'll share two of them. One of them is from Iraq, El Anbar province. We had a sign outside our combat outpost as you would leave the wire, so to speak, to go out into Al Anbar province, and it was a sign that said "complacency kills." And so it was a reminder to everyone that left the wire that you needed to be, once you left that wire, it was game on. And everything that we had trained to do, we were going to do, and we're going to take the fight to Al Qaeda, which is exactly what we did. In this particular instance, my lead platoon, it was the first day of an operation, a 10-day operation, to hunt Al Qaeda in the western parts of Al Anbar province near the Syrian border, and the platoon of vehicles, 4 vehicles, came upon 2 water trucks and a Bedouin camp. Unbeknownst to the Marines who dismounted the vehicles to search the camp, there were 6 Al Qaeda operatives in the top of a water truck, and they came up over the top of the truck and fired RPGs and engaged the Marines, machine guns, and lost 1 Marine, 3 Marines wounded, really in the course of about 3-4 minutes. The Marines subsequently engaged the vehicles and killed all the Al Qaeda, killed the insurgents. What happened then, was a decision, and again, a testament to our training. It's something has gone wrong, something has gone bad. We immediately medevaced the wounded and the dead Marine, and then brought up other vehicles and cross-loaded those vehicles with more Marines so that they could continue the mission for the rest of the 9 days. And those Marines did that. So the Marines that were part of that engagement, that were not wounded, we continued the mission. We, just like our SOP talked about, we cross-loaded those vehicles and continue to hunt Al Qaeda in Al Anbar, for those next 9 days. Look at that, you ask yourself, it's a hard call to make. Is it a cold? In my mind, it was absolutely the right thing to do. I mean, there was an enemy out there. There were more of them. We wanted to find them. We had Al Qaeda at that time in 2007 on the run in the desert. We'd pushed them out of the population centers, and they were on the run. So just wanted to continue being aggressive, and I just remember giving the order over the radio, push, right. Find them, find more of these individuals. I think it was a little bit more flowery than that, but the first thing. So they went for 9 days. We were all in the desert, and then met up back at our combat outpost on the 10th day. Returned from patrol, and the first thing I did was to meet with those crews, meet with the Marines that were wounded, that were down at the hospital, in Al-Assad. But the first thing I did was to meet with those crews that had gone through all that. Their buddies had been either wounded or killed, but they still continued the mission. Those ones that were still able in those vehicles. And so just pulling those guys aside, talking about it in a very professional but brotherly manner. We all cried. We talked about it. They had received updates, so kept them updated how everybody was doing and who we lost, and then proceeded over the next course of about the next 3 or 4 days to do a memorial service for the Marine that we lost, and make sure that those Marines were evacuated back home, and we linked up with them, of course, when we got back. But it's just some of those decisions are hard, but we are there to conduct a mission, and I felt perhaps like not unlike some of these decisions that were made by McClellan or Lee, not in no comparison to either of those gentlemen,
right?
But just the burden of command,
yes,
and having to make those decisions to what do you do? There was no question, no question in my mind. But again, it goes back to a testament of train like you fight, because you'll fight like you've trained.
Right.
It just applies.
Now, there's a lot of people out there that may not have been able to serve or have an opportunity such as you have, that we experienced something that kind of took the wind out of your lungs and, made you, as well as your Marines, really think deep and have that stress or post-trauma stress. But there are a lot of listeners that have experienced issues, whether it's a loved one just being diagnosed with a terminal illness, the boss coming in saying, they're fired, a loved one saying that, I'm done. And in your situations, as you described, your personal leadership is one thing, but you also, as a leader, you have many other resources. And can you talk about the importance of, as a commanding officer, you have a senior enlisted that can be very useful in helping those that have that. You have a chaplain, you have other Marines that can be friends, but a lot of people choose to try to be going off on their own as a lone wolf. And how have you seen the positives of when experts and people who care can surround somebody, or the detriment of somebody that's deciding, I'll try to figure this out on my own, I'm okay, and they isolate themselves or they utilize some substance? Yeah. And what's the difference that you've seen with both those methods?
Well, I think we do have a great support infrastructure that is within each command, whether it's a spouses group or the chaplain or senior enlisted advisor. I think what I try to share with what you try to share with folks that are going through tough times is that they're not alone, right? And I think the older you get, I know you sit down and you've got a individual across from you that's going through something that's just so horrible or so heartbreaking that it's really nobody else can understand it, when the truth is somebody does understand it, and it may be the person sitting across the table from you. So I think just being a good and effective listener to what's really going on with that person, whether they're having family problems or it's professional, or it's it's something that they're struggling with in their own life with substance abuse. I think there's organizations out there that are outside the scope of the of your organization that can benefit the individual and his or her family to help them get through it. I like to look at it as if you have to expend all avenues to try and help that person or have that person improve that situation. And it's called expanding your combat multiplier. So if we're unable to address it within our organization, what other organizations are there out there that can assist, in helping to resolve the problem, whether it's counseling, whether it's a course, just opening up the aperture, to provide assistance to the individual. I think again, it's like being creative in training. It's being creative on the battlefield, thinking critically. How do you do the same, execute the same sequence of decision making, right, when you're trying to help someone as well. I really don't think it's any different. You pull out all stops to go after the enemy. You pull out all stops to help your fellow Marine or help your fellow coworker, because there are and the people that are in those situations don't always, they can't see the forest through the trees. So.
Right. Interesting you say that. And what if the situation changes just slightly, where you as a leader are not now trying to assist somebody who is in your command, but say your instance, or if you're counseling someone that it was yourself, or you're advising someone where it is themselves and they were in a position, maybe it's temporarily, but the workload, the stress is too much, or they've had some form of loss. Maybe it's a business owner who's had a lot of financial loss and that concern. How would you, from your experiences, how would you advise someone that's themselves and they may not feel like they want to open up to somebody, but what are some recommendations and best practices as far as somebody that's carrying that stress inside? I know some people handle it with some physical training, just to get rid of it, or talking or looking at a large perspective and trying to figure out different solutions. What would you advise somebody that's listening that's in a position or in a tight spot?
Again, I would reiterate the fact that somebody's gone through what you're going through. There's no doubt in my mind. Somebody has gone through it, and if I'm sitting across the table from you, I would just ask that you just be honest and own it. I think that's part of it, being able to share that honestly and openly, that you truly want to offer options to help them, and ask, just again, being a good listener, listening to what they have to say and asking them, asking them to share the truth of the issue with you.
What if it's somebody that they themselves, like from your experience, you as a leader, and you may not want to talk to somebody, but what is the recommendation to handle that stress, to maintain your sanity, or being able to accomplish over something very challenging over a long period of time where it doesn't seem like they could do it? What would you recommend somebody in that senior leadership position, whether a commanding officer, a CEO, chief operating officer, that may have some doubts on if they can do that, their job?
Right. So I think when I when I dealt with things that I thought were hard, and I would go to another commander, right? Yes. I'd go to another lieutenant, another battalion commander, another colonel, and share with them, hey, are you having the same problem? I kind of, right. So you try and I would go to someone what I felt was equal ground, yes. Where maybe I wasn't going to share it with a sergeant major, but I go to another battalion commander or another commander. It is true that I think as you grow in rank, it's lonely at the top type of thing, right? Yes. So you have fewer and fewer people that, at least in perception, that you can share those things with. So someone of like job or like profession that you trust, I would seek them out to say, hey, look, we're both CEOs or chief financial advisor, someone that you trust to help maybe resolve and provide some options in that specific discipline. I think those folks are probably out there, since if you're in that profession, you're in that billet. There's somebody else in a similar billet that you can engage with.
Yes.
I would hope. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yes. Well, I know your leadership experience has covered, it's taken you not just coast to coast around the world, but a lifetime of service to our country, and really appreciate not just that service in a saying, and that you're still serving the country in the capacity, of our national defense, but being a mentor to myself and many others that needed that encouragement, that approval, that it's okay to, reach out to go that extra step and go hard and to take risks is not often. I feel very blessed that I was in a situation with, Colonel Alexander is my company commander and a battalion commander who was really encouraging you to take those risks and to be mentally, physically aggressive, and to lead your men as though they're your own brothers, and look out for them. Everything that your example at as a officer candidate, not even a pay grade, just somebody being screened, but you're trooping the lines then, in a lot of people, there was a lot of uncertainty, but he was somebody that was encouraging, and at the same time trying to find who those leaders were, who those warriors that should be the ones screened. That was very encouraging at the moment and throughout especially the formative years and then my career. So, is there any other parting recommendations that you would want to pass on to the listeners?
I think that leaders make a difference, and I think that in your various professions, you can have an impact if you want to, and that as you form your teams, that they know that they are part of that leadership dynamic within your team, and everybody should have responsibility. Everybody should have accountability. Everybody should, be able to have that speed of trust. Should be afforded that, and I think once you treat everybody as a leader, treat everybody as a human being. I think it works out well for almost every organization, and I'm just really honored, Fred, that you had me here to do this, and I don't know. I think I learned as much from you as maybe you have from me. It's just always an honor and a privilege to be with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. And it's indeed an honor to, after all these years, be able to reconnect. And that is one thing that really want to encourage the listeners, that some have moved on from a particular job or possibly the military, friends from one phase of life, whether it's high school or college. And it's really easy these days to get isolated. And I'm not a mental health professional, but that does put people at a tremendous disadvantage, is when those strong cords that are close together, that are hard to be broken, but once you're isolated, it creates a lot of doubt, and you don't have somebody like Colonel Alexander was mentioning to share ideas with, and on a daily basis. That's something that's very important to myself and those that I still maintain contact with, is asking those questions, asking somebody to review what you're thinking, and who those people that you can trust and rely on for ideas and encouragement. And that's something that all listeners, as we're trying to get to the naked truths, nothing here is scripted or, paid advertisement. It's something that we hope to, pass on to you that will embolden and improve your lives. And we appreciate, you being able to help sponsor the show, to, bring us together to an interesting place like here in Sharpsburg, Maryland, where we are able to do an incredible study of Antietam, the one day that was the bloodiest day in American history. So really appreciate all the listeners out there. Thank you, and you have a great day and blessed day, and we'll look forward to our next show in the future.
Another person that was highly influential in my upbringing was obviously my mother. My mother taught me to be a negotiator. She taught me the value of unconditional love, and I learned those things from her. And I'll give a vignette about how she encouraged me to work with other people, and those paid big dividends in the combat zone in Iraq and Afghanistan, and meeting with tribal leaders, being involved in shuras. And so I was probably about 8 years old and was out on the playground, and I'd organized a bunch of kids to basically conduct a charge across the playground, and there was another group as well, and we were kind of battling each other. It was just having fun on the playground. But as we swept through the playground, knocked some kids down, and I got in quite a bit of trouble for it. And on the other end of the playground, as we passed through, ran into this other group and proceeded to get in a fight. And I think I got suspended from school for that, but went home, and my mom said, she said, why don't you just co-op that other group, and you guys can just work it out together, and you'd have more fun together. And so that was my first lesson in being able to negotiate and being able to kind of treat other people as you'd like to be treated, and I did that and learned a lot from her. And it's significant that I think I do it on this day because my mother passed away from cancer when I was a young second lieutenant. This is the anniversary of that, and I wanted to honor her as part of this podcast, just the influence, positive influence that she had on my life, and one of the reasons why I've been successful.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office. You are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at gocommandoshow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our six. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go Commando.